There was a thick, palpable silence in the air, broken only by the soft crackling of pine logs in the iron stove, and the occasional rustle of the wind gliding through the centuries-old fir trees.
Ivan Andreevich Bielov, nicknamed Voron, Raven, sat on a low stool, slowly sharpening the blade of his old, trusty hunting knife to razor sharpness.
The blade reflected the dim light from the window, and every glint, even the slightest, was under the control of his heavy, incredibly attentive gaze. This gaze seemed to be rooted in the depths of the taiga. It did not belong to the hut or to this time, but rather to the wild, primeval tranquility that surrounded his hut for many kilometers. Nearby, at his feet, curled up in a tight, almost invisible ball of grey fur, lay Shadow, his West Siberian Laika. She was asleep, but her ears twitched slightly, picking up frequencies inaudible to human ears. Ivan did not move, waiting. He had long since learned not to waste energy on unnecessary movement and not to be distracted by empty noise. He waited. An unexpected and rough roar of an engine, amplified by the echo of the mountain crevice, broke the silence like a gunshot in a temple. And the sound did not come from the forest, but from the road 7 kilometers away. The Raven did not move. He knew that these were not locals. The locals knew how to drive quietly, stalling the engine in advance and stepping on the gravel as if on moss. These were city dwellers, or those who had forgotten how to respect silence. Using the rumbling, well-worn UAZ of the district office. The Shadow raised its head, but seeing its owner's calmness, it only made a low, deep sound, more like a rumbling discontent than a bark, and lowered its nose back onto its paws. The Raven put down the knife, checking the blade with his thumb. It was perfect. They had come for some reason, and the fact that they had come already meant trouble. A quarter of an hour later, an engine roared outside the porch and a door slammed. Lieutenant Demyanov appeared on the threshold, a young man of 30, his face perpetually covered with sweat and dust, as if he had just emerged from the clutches of asphalt. Demyanov was diligent, but in this territory, beyond the map and the charter, he became a confused amateur. For Voron, he was a symbol of the very urban helplessness he despised. Ivan Andreevich, hello. Demyanov took off his cap, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. You look, as always. Am I interrupting? His voice was too loud and nervous, like that of a man who feels like a stranger in a strange land. Voron nodded silently, gesturing for him to come in. The Shadow rose and slowly approached the guest, sniffing his heavy, government-issue boots. Demyanov shuddered. It's bad news, Ivan Andreevich, Demyanov began, not bothering to sit down. They found a tourist, a Muscovite, in the middle of nowhere on the border of the reserve. They found him yesterday evening, but our people couldn't get there until this morning. Rich, influential. Yegor Kholodov, owner of a large development company. Voron leaned against the doorframe, crossing his sinewy arms over his chest. He didn't ask any questions. He waited for Demyanov to get to the point. He's torn apart. Everything looks like 100% bear attack. Broken bones, claw marks, you know. The problem is that everyone, absolutely everyone, wants it to be a bear attack. The word everyone sounded like a code. Voron knew what everyone meant. It meant the bosses, the politicians, the businessmen who didn't want any scandal surrounding their Siberian interests. A bear attack was an accident that could be written off and forgotten. Murder meant an investigation, checks, and the involvement of the FSB. So what's stopping you from closing the case? Voron's low, hoarse voice sounded like gravel rolling down a mountain stream. He spoke slowly and sparingly, as if each word cost him inner energy. Demyanov hesitated, his gaze darting around the hut as if he were looking for a clue in the chimney. Well, first of all, his guide, a local, disagrees. He says that Kholodov was an experienced tourist, knew how to behave in the taiga, and would never have pitched a tent in such a place. Second, this bear. It's been bothering us for a long time. It's been tagged. We know its habits. It never attacks. It's just curious. But there's such fury, Ivan Andreevich. Our forensic experts, who flew in by helicopter, say that this is not typical even for a bear. And then the lieutenant lowered his voice, even though only Shadow and Raven were around. Then I found this. He pulled a plastic bag out of his pocket. Inside was a crumpled piece of fabric soaked in brown mud, which had apparently been torn from some piece of clothing. Raven took the bag without touching its contents. He just looked closely through the plastic. It wasn't just fabric. It was a synthetic material used in expensive, urban, but very durable hiking clothes. Moreover, the edge was not torn, but seemed to have been cut or tightly pinched by something sharp and strong. "What's unusual about this piece of cloth?" asked Voron. "It doesn't belong to the victim," Demyanov replied quickly. "Kholodov had a different jacket, and there are no such cuts on it. We checked. And this piece. It smells, Ivan Andreevich. Not rot, not blood, but something." He waved his hand, unable to find the right word. Voron caught this hesitation. He understood that Demyanov was not looking for the logic of the crime, but for its justification. He needed Voron, so that if something went wrong, he would have someone to blame. "We need your signature, Ivan Andreevich, confirming that you have inspected the site and, as an expert on predators, confirmed the bear theory," Demyanov blurted out, returning to his main goal. "We'll pay any amount, as a consultation fee." Voron nodded slowly, but there was no agreement in his eyes. "I'll go there," said Voron, his gaze refocusing on the scrap of fabric. "But not to confirm your version, and not for money. I don't need you to cover up this case. I need to see what the bear didn't manage to wipe off the face of the earth. I need to read what really happened in this place." For him, it wasn't work. It was an intrusion into his world. Someone had used the laws of the taiga to hide human baseness. It was a violation of the order, and Voron was not going to forgive such a sin. He dismissed all talk of Kholodov, his wealth, and his Moscow connections. He thought only of the bear, which had apparently been used as a living weapon, and of the man who had dared to violate the sacred neutrality of the wild. Demyanov sighed heavily, but did not argue. He knew that if Voron had decided to see, he would see. And if he saw the truth, it would be impossible to buy his way out of it. "We're leaving now. The place is called the mouth of the Black River, 30 kilometers along the old logging road, then another hour on foot," said the lieutenant. "Our cordoning group is waiting there." Voron was already putting on his heavy, time-worn canvas backpack. Tin, as if reading her master's thoughts, jumped up and whimpered softly, ready for the long journey. Voron took one last look at the stove, at the quiet, cozy chaos of his home, which he would have to leave behind for the sake of a dirty, unnatural story. The violation of the order required intervention. And Raven, a former senior state inspector,
and now a philosopher of the taiga, could not abandon his duty. He took his binoculars and knife and went out, allowing the lieutenant to hurry after him.
Now the hunt was on, not for a beast, but for a man who tried to pretend to be a beast. The smoke-filled UAZ, reeking of government gasoline, took Ivan Andreevich and Lieutenant Demyanov to the edge of the cordon, where the old logging road, like a severed vein, ended at the floodplain of the Black River. From there, they could only continue on foot through the thick, damp undergrowth. The first thing that hit their noses when they got out of the car was not blood, but a suffocating mixture of formaldehyde, disinfectants, and cheap cigarette smoke that the city experts had brought with them. There was an unnatural noise for this place, the quiet swearing of the police, the crunch of plastic boots on the moss, the buzzing of a drone launched to film from above, and constant chatter on the radios. The taiga seemed to cower from this sudden intrusion, becoming gloomy and tense, like a coiled spring. Raven didn't like it when nature reacted to humans like this. It always meant that the intruder had brought something alien with them, something that even this ancient land couldn't digest. Demyanov pushed him ingratiatingly toward the narrow path. "Over there, Ivan Andreevich, our group. You'll pass quickly. We trampled all the tracks while we were cordoning off the area, but the main thing is the object itself." Voron remained silent, his gaze already scanning the forest above their heads, ignoring the lieutenant. He saw not the object, but the place where the law of life had been violated, and all the fuss around it was just dust, irrelevant to what had happened. He walked around the bustling circle of police officers and experts, who looked ridiculous in their bright, clean overalls. Yegor Kholodov, a Moscow developer, lay in a hollow near a fallen cedar tree. More precisely, what was left of the man lay there. Looking at the mutilated remains, any inexperienced person would immediately confirm the version. An animal attack. No questions asked, no doubts. But Voron was not inexperienced. He stopped a few steps away, allowing the shadow which followed him like his living shadow to stop nearby. Shadow did not whine or growl. She only raised her sharp muzzle, drew in a breath, and the hair on her neck slowly stood on end. Not out of fear, but out of a deep, instinctive revulsion. He's not afraid, thought Raven. He despises. It was the first, non-verbal conclusion he trusted more than any protocols. He crouched down. His eyes, the eyes of a bird of prey, began their silent, slow work. He started with the most obvious clues, the body, which was the central link in the chain of lies. The wounds were horrific, but Raven looked for a pattern, a signature in the chaos. A bear attacking a human in the wild rarely seeks to kill for food. More often, it is defense, desperation, or accident. Such attacks are chaotic. The first blow with claws to knock the victim off their feet, growling, an attempt to retreat if the victim does not surrender. Here, everything was different. Raven noticed that the deepest, most deadly injuries in the neck and chest area were inflicted with excessive, almost demonstrative force. The bones were not just broken, they were shattered, as if the beast wanted not to satisfy its hunger, but to destroy, to erase the very idea of this man's existence. And these wounds, inflicted with sharp, powerful fangs, were located in places where the man could no longer resist, after he had been immobilized. This was not an act of attack. It was an act of completion. Then he turned his attention to the tracks around him. Demyanov was right. The ground was covered with boot prints and stained with patches from plastic mats. But Voron looked at the tracks beneath that layer of dirt. The tracks left by the first animals. Bear tracks. It was a large male. Voron determined its weight and age by the depth of the dents and the width of the paws. He studied the fingerprints, which revealed the animal's gait. And here was the first real anomaly. The bear's tracks led to Kholodov's body in a straight, confident trajectory, as if the predator was walking toward its target and had not stumbled upon unexpected prey. An attacking animal, even a predator, usually moves in a zigzag pattern, sniffing and exercising caution. This animal walked as if it knew what awaited it and was not afraid. The raven rose. His gaze fell on the trees that stood in a semicircle around the place of death. There was not a single trace on the trunks, indicating that the victim had tried to climb them. Not a scratch, not a scrap of fabric. The man had not fought back, or his struggle had been very brief. But most importantly, Raven noticed vertical stripes left by claws about 1.5 meters up on one of the cedars. They were not deep, nor were they fierce. It was a mark left by a male bear to mark his territory. And this mark was left later, or immediately before, the bear went to the body. The beast first staked out the territory, and then approached the victim. For Voron, this was equivalent to the predator receiving an invitation to dinner, and knowing that he was in no danger. The bear did not attack, Voron concluded. He spoke softly, but his voice instantly drowned out all other noises, including the buzzing of the drone. He was finishing eating, or completing the job. Lieutenant Demyanov, who had been waiting nervously on the sidelines, came closer. "What do you mean, Ivan Andreevich? It's torn apart. Bones." Voron turned to him, and his eyes flashed with that same bird-like piercing coldness that had given him his nickname. "Demyanov, you don't see the difference between the fury of a hunted beast and the fury of a fed beast. This bear felt no fear. He was not hungry. He was released or invited to do his job, and he worked with unprecedented, unnatural, unmotivated malice. Such fury is not born in the forest. It is born in man, and man controlled it." Raven shifted his gaze to the perimeter. He was not looking for traces of Kholodov or the police, but for what was left of the bait, of the man who knew how to make the most powerful predator of the taiga work for him. And since the bear was walking in a straight line, it meant that the bait had been applied either to the victim's body or to something nearby. This was not the instinct of a wild animal. It was a precise science applied to murder. Raven felt a deep insult to the laws by which he lived. The boundary had been violated. Only Shadow, twitching sensitively, turned her nose in the opposite direction from the bear's tracks. There, according to the dog, was the real source of this unhealthy, alien smell. Without looking at the lieutenant, Raven followed her, ignoring Demyanov's cries. All this police fuss was now just a distraction for him. He had to find out what a person capable of such meanness smelled like. He moved 20 paces away from the crime scene, following Shadow, who behaved like a living compass pointing to falsehood. The dog led him to an area that had been completely ignored by the official cordon. Here, under the thick branches of a fir tree, the grass and moss were trampled, but not by boots. Raven knelt down. At first, he saw only crushed fern leaves, but looking closer, he noticed 2 small, almost invisible indentations left by a very thin but hard sole. They were not Kholodov's trekking boots, nor were they army police. They were shoes designed for silent, quick movement in the forest, possibly hunting moccasins or light boots. The footprints were shallow, but their shape suggested that the person who left them was sinewy and strong, not weighed down by excess weight. Most importantly, the footprints led from the cedar tree where the murder took place and disappeared into thick, untouched undergrowth where bears did not venture. The raven sniffed cautiously at the trampled moss, careful not to damage it. The shadow growled softly, confirming his guess. The smell was barely perceptible, but it was there. It was not the chemical smell that Demyanov had described, but its base note, something oily, pungent, with a hint of animal musk. It was a fixative, the base for a synthetic attractant. A professional would not use a homemade remedy. He would take something that was guaranteed to overpower the smell of a human. This smell, which did not belong to the forest, did not belong to the victim, was the only real clue that pointed to the killer. The raven rose, his gaze cold and stubbornly satisfied. He knew what he was doing, and more importantly, he knew who he was looking for. Not a bandit, but someone who lived by his rules, but betrayed them. A man who spoke the same language as the taiga, but used that language to deceive. He had to understand the bear's motives in order to catch the man who had set him up. He returned to the place where the predator's tracks began and started moving in the opposite direction, not toward the body, but away from it. He had to trace the bear's path to understand whether it had been brought here from afar or had been waiting nearby. It was not just forensics, but the psychology of a predator. Voron ignored Demyanov's hysterical pleas to come back and testify. He was already in another world, a world where only tracks and smells spoke. He walked along the edge of the thickets, his eyes catching every broken twig, every displaced stone. The bear walked confidently, that much was clear. But where was he going before the murder? Half an hour later, after passing through very dense thickets and jumping over a small hidden stream, Voron found what he was looking for: the waiting place. At the foot of a massive cedar tree, on the edge of an open glade, there was a small flat area that had been trampled down. It was a bed, but a temporary one. The beast had spent several hours here, and more importantly, there were signs of his impatience. Claws had scratched the ground, and there were deep, fresh grooves in the bark of the cedar, left not to mark his territory, but out of irritation or excitement. The bear had not slept or eaten. He had been waiting. It waited for a command, waited for a scent, waited for the bait to work to its full effect. The raven realized that this was no random animal. It was a specific bear, trained to recognize a certain scent, which knew that when that scent grew stronger, a reward awaited it. It was monstrously simple and disgustingly effective. The killer was not just a poacher or a gamekeeper. He was a puppeteer in the taiga, a specialist who used natural instinct as the perfect tool to conceal his evil deeds. Raven felt his inner silence give way to an icy, calm determination. He knew this man would not get away. This was no longer a matter for the police, but his personal restoration of order. He turned and walked away without looking back, following the bear's trail, to now find the man's trail. From the moment Raven walked away from the body, beaten by the bear's madness, he ceased to be a consultant on murder. He became a trapper, studying his prey. First, he traced the predator's path in reverse, finding the place where it had waited impatiently by the old cedar tree. Now he went further into the forest to understand why the bear was in the area at all and how long it had been near its prey before the attack. He needed to determine the animal's inner state, hunger or anger, survival instinct or induced madness. Only then could he understand the motives of the one who controlled them. The shadow following him worked without command, its nose lowered to the ground. But it was not searching. It listened to scents that only Raven could detect, but could not interpret as fully. The bear walked along its usual, well-trodden paths. Raven read the information, as if leafing through the pages of a diary. He saw that, according to Quoter, the beast had been moving slowly, without haste, over the past day. He found its fresh resting place, just half a kilometer from the scene of the crime, under thick fir trees. It was not the resting place where the beast waited for bait, but the one where it rested. Examining the resting place, Voron noted that it was clean, with no debris or remains of prey. Moreover, nearby, in a hollow where the sun warmed the stones, there were particularly large, ripe blueberries growing. Judging by the tracks, the bear had spent a lot of time there feeding. His paws left prints on the moss and stones, clearly indicating satiety and calm. This season's taiga berry harvest was abundant, and the bear was clearly not hungry. There were no signs that he was looking for large prey, no attempts to dig up anthills or hunt young moose. He was full, content, and neutral. This completely ruled out the possibility of a random attack for food. The beast was in a perfect, non-hunting state at that moment. The raven moved away from the resting place, feeling his suspicions harden like cooling granite. A bear that is not hungry, that is not cornered, and that is not protecting its cubs, does not attack a human with such demonstrative fury. The only thing that could break this natural logic was outside interference. He returned to his earliest observations. Unnatural malice in the act. It was provoked, directed fury. He continued to study the bear's trail, but now he was looking for a second chain of events. The path of the bait. The person who controlled the predator must have known its habits, its territory, and may have already had contact with it. Raven discovered several places where the bear had stopped. In one such place, near an old ruined feeder that had once been used to feed ungulates, he noticed several strange details. Among the remains of last year's moss and litter, Shadow suddenly began to dig cautiously. Raven stopped her with a gesture, crouching down himself. He did not believe in miracles, but he believed in the accuracy of his own eyes. Under a layer of moss, he found something that the police, looking only for large tracks, would never have noticed. It was a piece of metal foil, stained with a greasy brown substance. At first glance, it looked like food wrapper, but the foil was thick, not food grade, and the substance on it did not smell like meat, but like the very same synthetic, alien scent he had caught at the crime scene. It was concentrated bait. It was used to accustom the bear to a certain smell, so that this smell would become a signal for action or reward. Raven carefully used the tip of his knife to separate the oily lump and wrapped it in a clean, oiled piece of cloth. This smell, this chemistry, was the key to the killer's identity. A person who used such means was not an ordinary hunter. He was a specialist, possibly a former gamekeeper or a scientist working with population control. The hypothesis took shape, becoming as solid as ice. The tourist Kholodov was either dead or immobilized when the bear approached. The killer applied a high concentration of attractant to his body or clothing. The beast, already accustomed to this smell, came for its reward. It found Kholodov and, excited by the smell and possibly provoked by induced rage, did its dirty work. Destroying all evidence of human intervention, it was the perfect cover for the murder. The killer was a predator, and its tracks were a natural phenomenon. Lured. Voron whispered into the thick silence of the taiga, and the whisper sounded like a sentence. He stood up and adjusted his backpack. Now his task had changed. He was no longer looking for Kholodov's motive. He was looking for the source of that smell, the one who created or received it, and the one who knew the habits of this particular bear in order to use it as a puppet. He walked around the place where he had found the foil, expanding his search radius, and in the thick spruce forest, where no one would pass by accidentally, he found something that confirmed his suspicion. A shoe print, the same thin, deep, but light footprint he had seen at the murder scene, in a layer that had not been trampled by the police. It was not a tourist's boot, but a professional hunting boot, with a very specific tread that is not sold in regular stores. Moreover, this tread was worn unevenly, which indicated a specific, slightly limping but confident gait. Raven felt a rush of cold, focused energy. He gave Shadow a command that she understood without words. Look for the scent, not of an animal, a stranger's scent. The dog, as if understanding the seriousness of the moment, stopped looking for play or food. Her nose rose. She made a wide, slow circle, and her body, flexible and sinewy, tensed. She had found it, and her movement was directed away from the scene of the murder, away from the tourist trail. Without wasting time returning to Demyanov to tell him about his hypothesis, the Raven made a decision. He would follow this trail. He did not believe in laboratories. He did not believe in interrogations that would distort the truth. He believed only in what the Earth had shown him. And the Earth said that somewhere in this taiga was hiding a specialist who had betrayed his knowledge and used the ancient laws of nature for the lowest of human crimes. Murder for gain, covered up by wild rage. And now that he knew it was not a bear that was to blame for the fury, but a man, his own determination became cold and merciless. He had to find the trail before the rain washed it away, before the killer had time to completely cover his tracks. He and Shadow, two predators, set out on the trail of the third, most dangerous one, who wore human form. He went into the deepest wilderness, where the maps ended and reality began. After Ivan Andreevich was finally convinced that the bear was only a tool in the hands of a specialist, his attention shifted from the animal to the man. He moved away from the bear's lair to where the beast's trail was interrupted, and where, according to Voron's logic, the killer's trail began. He needed to find what the bear, despite all its fury and keen sense of smell, had missed. Small, barely discernible signs that spoke of the criminal's habits, occupation, and psychology. The taiga is an open book, but it has pages written in a language other than that of animals. Voron moved slowly but steadily, his body sinewy and weather-beaten, perfectly suited for such reading. He did not look where he was going. He looked where the man before him had looked. The shadow walked ahead, working with the scent, freed from the confusing smell of bear and blood. The dog now focused on that very foreign scent. A sharp, chemical, and at the same time oily aroma that Raven identified as the basis for a synthetic attractant. The scent was barely perceptible, but for Shadow, trained to search not for game but for humans, it was like a thread in the darkness. The first thing that confirmed the criminal's profile was a shoe print that Raven had already seen at the murder scene, but now he found it in a cleaner and more intact form, under the canopy of an old fir tree. It was the imprint of a specialized hunting boot. The tread pattern was finely embossed, designed for quiet, soft movement on moss and damp ground, rather than rough traction on rocks. Such treads were used by professional trappers or gamekeepers, for whom it was important not to scare away animals with noise. But most importantly, Voron noticed specific, uneven wear on the outside of the heel. This indicated an old, barely noticeable limp, or a habit of placing the foot at a slight angle, a tiny detail that could only be gleaned from prolonged tracking. Further on, Voron found not just a trail, but a gesture in a place where thick raspberry bushes blocked the path. The person did not try to push through the bushes, but carefully bent the branches in 3 different places to pass without breaking them or leaving characteristic combed marks on the fabric. This was not the movement of a tourist, but of a master who knew that he would need this path again and again. He took care of his route. This spoke of composure, confidence, and territoriality. Finally, 50 meters from the trampled trail, the shadow suddenly froze. Its tail stopped moving. The dog cautiously sniffed a small boulder covered with moss. The Raven approached. On the stone, in a small natural niche protected from the rain, he found what he was looking for. These were the remains of the bait. Here, apparently, the killer stored or mixed the components before applying them to the victim or the territory. In the niche lay a half-rotten wooden splinter, saturated with a concentrated smell that was now, in the warmth, more pronounced. It was the same chemical musk, but mixed with the smell of gunpowder and gun oil. By combining these 3 findings, the specific footprints with wear, the careful approach to the trail, and the chemical bait with the smell of gunpowder, Voron was able to sketch a detailed, albeit incomplete, profile of the criminal. He was a local resident, or someone who had lived in the taiga for a very long time. He knew the forest better than any of the police or tourists. His profession was related to hunting, security, or trapping. He was physically strong, but had an old leg injury that made his gait unique. And most importantly, he was cold-blooded. To kill, use the animal as a scavenger, and at the same time be so careful as not to leave a single tear in the fabric or fingerprint behind, is the work of a man for whom Kholodov's life was nothing more than expendable material, and the forest was a laboratory. Voron picked up a splinter. The smell was so strong that, despite his habit, he felt his nerves tense up. He recognized the smell. Not the attractant itself, which was obviously a synthetic development, but its carrier. It was a base used to repel small rodents, but in this region, it was sometimes used to make fake pheromones for poaching. The attractant was most likely obtained illegally, or made from stolen components. The profile of the criminal, as if painted with a brush against the backdrop of the taiga, was ready. A former gamekeeper, Or perhaps the very same guide, Kholodov, that Demyanov had mentioned. Someone who had been close to the victim in his final hours, who knew the location, who had access to specific, almost laboratory-grade equipment, and who could cold-bloodedly use a bear. Voron returned to the scene of the murder. The police had already loaded the remains into the helicopter. Demyanov was waiting for him, pacing nervously. "Ivan Andreevich, what do you say? A bear? We're ready to close the case." Voron stopped. His gaze was empty and deep. He handed the lieutenant an oily splinter. "This is your truth, Demyanov. The bear was lured. This is murder. Look for a man with a limp, who knows how to make a beast kill for him. The smell of gunpowder and someone else's trap. That's all I can give you." Demyanov looked at the splinter, at Voron, then at the departing helicopter carrying away the body of the Muscovite. His eyes showed a mixture of horror and doom. Murder. In his quiet neighborhood, committed with such sophistication. Voron did not say another word to him. Now he had to find the path the killer had taken himself, because he knew that the police would be looking for motives, money and documents, not trampled moss and someone else's trail. And the killer, meanwhile, would be getting deeper and deeper into the forest. He had to continue reading the taiga. Voron and Shadow headed for where the trail of the hunting boot ended. The trail led to an old, barely noticeable gap between the cedars, which only someone who knew this taiga thoroughly could notice. The criminal, apparently, was not running, but walking, confidently and steadily, as if he knew that they were looking for him elsewhere. Ivan Andreevich, watching Shadow quietly slip through the opening, felt that this case involved not only a criminal trail, but also something deeply personal. This killer had not simply committed a crime. He had challenged the law of nature, which Raven considered sacred. He had used the great beast as a tool, desecrating its instinct. And now Raven, as the restorer of balance, had to find him. He entered the hole, and thick pine needles closed behind him, separating him from the bustling, false world of the city dwellers. Now he was back on his own territory, and his hunt had truly begun. He followed the trail of a man who smelled of chemicals and gunpowder. A man who knew the forest, but had betrayed it. Ivan Andreevich followed the trail that the Shadow had left behind. The killer's trail was not just a trail on the ground. It was a kind of draft, written by a man who was absolutely confident in his invisibility. They went deeper into the taiga, away from tourist routes and logging roads. The criminal was in no hurry. Voron, reading the depth of the imprint of a specific hunting boot and the interval between steps, determined that the man was moving steadily, conserving his strength like an experienced traveler. There was no panic, no nervous haste of a fugitive. This confirmed the profile. Cold-blooded, physically strong, a local specialist. Voron's method was to read the traces of movement. He didn't just see where the foot had stepped. He saw why it had stepped there. In the area where thick fallen trees created a complex maze, the killer did not step over or around the trunks, but made his way under them, using the minimum space so that his silhouette would not stand out against the horizon. This indicated two things. First, he was carrying a small but heavy load, possibly poison, a tool to immobilize the victim, or, more likely, Kholodov's personal belongings that needed to be destroyed. Second, he used stealth skills, as if he were not just leaving, but hiding. Voron noticed how the killer walked across the wet moss, which was particularly slippery in this spot, where an ordinary person would have left deep, uncertain footprints or even slipped. This man used the stones and roots that barely protruded from the moss, transferring his body weight accurately and quickly. It was the art of moving through the terrain, honed to a reflex. Raven saw that the killer avoided any areas where his tracks might be trampled by other animals. He walked along the edge of their trails, using natural barriers as protection. This was not just a trail. It was the handwritten route of a man who knew he was being sought, but knew how to make himself invisible to everyone except Raven. Along the way, the killer left rare but important details that were glaring clues to Raven's eye. On a branch of a low fir tree, broken too neatly for the wind, Raven found a barely noticeable piece of thread sticking out of the resin. The thread was dark green, made of a synthetic but very durable material. Used in modern hunting camouflage suits, but not in ordinary hiking clothes. This thread indicated that the killer had not just put on old boots, but had also taken care to equip himself completely for stealthy movement and a long stay in the forest. He was not planning to escape, but to lie low for a long time. Further on, at the edge of a small marsh, Raven discovered the spot where the killer had stopped for a short rest. There was no fire here, only trampled moss. And in this moss, Ivan Andreevich found the imprint of a heavy object placed next to a foot. It was not a tent or a backpack. The mark was square and flat, with rounded edges, and its depth indicated considerable weight. Voron bent down, and Shadow cautiously sniffed the spot. This time, the dog did not detect a foreign scent. Only a slight smell of metal and damp earth. Raven concluded that it was some kind of tool that the killer was carrying, possibly gold mining tools. Or, worse, a weapon with optics, which could be quite heavy. They crossed another hill, and the trail led them down to a small mountain stream that was a tributary of the Black River. The stream was fast-flowing, with a rocky bottom and cold, clear waters. And here the trail ended. The last boot prints were right by the bank, and beyond that, there were only slippery rocks that left no traces. The criminal had used the water as a natural neutralizer of smell and traces. He had either waded across the stream and then continued on the rocks, or, more likely, used a boat or something else that could carry him and his heavy load. The Raven stopped. He walked along the bank of the stream in both directions, carefully examining the stones and looking for the slightest hint of a scrape or flattened grass that might indicate a way out of the water. But nothing. Water, that ancient element of the taiga, had absorbed all traces of man. The killer was not just a specialist, but a master of camouflage. He used his limp to confuse his gait, his equipment to leave no traces, and the water to cover his tracks. He did not run, but disappeared, becoming part of the landscape. Ivan Andreevich realized that further tracking by scent and footprints was useless. Now, in order to find the man, he had to return to the people, to find a motive and a weapon. If the killer was carrying a heavy load, probably related to the gold he had stolen or the destruction of Kholodov's documents, and used the waterway, he must have had a boat, or at least an old crossing, and such things always leave traces in human memory, or on old maps. Voron took a deep breath and felt a cold disappointment. He despised the need to return to the city filth, to interrogations, false testimony, and bureaucratic red tape. But to find this trace on the water, he needed to know more about the victim. what his money smelled like, who he crossed paths with, which of the locals could have worked with him and then betrayed him. He took out his old horse walkie-talkie, which he rarely used. The walkie-talkie belonged to the Sion Nature Reserve, and it was his only connection to the outside world in this wilderness. Demyanov, Voron said quietly but confidently. The trail ended at the stream. He used the water. I'm coming back. I need all the names, the whole Kholodov group, especially the guide who was with him. And I need a map of the area showing the old mines and abandoned settlements. Demyanov, on the other end of the radio, was apparently waiting for him to confirm the accident, and his voice sounded confused. Mines. Ivan Andreevich, we already map names. No stupid questions. Raven cut him off. He didn't wait for an answer and turned off the radio. Now he had to switch from the language of tracks to the language of human meanness. And that was the hardest thing for him. To look people in the eye again. To look for lies in their intonations, not in the trampled moss. He felt that the shadow would suffer more from the smell of lies than from the smell of chemical bait. Raven sighed heavily, turned, and began his return journey toward the noise, the bustle, the city filth, to learn what the victim had not had time to tell him herself. He needed to know which of the locals was smart and strong enough, not only to frame the bear, but also to leave nothing behind but a barely noticeable piece of thread and the smell of gunpowder. The killer wasn't just hiding. He was disguised as wild nature, and Raven had to tear off that mask using only the tools that man had betrayed. The earth, the forest, and instinct. He walked toward people, but his thoughts were already far away, in the places where, according to his assumption, the killer must be hiding. Places known only to the initiated. Old gold mines. Returning from the forest, Raven found the temporary police headquarters set up in an abandoned hunting lodge by the logging road. The atmosphere there was heavy, saturated with fatigue, bureaucracy, and fear. Lieutenant Demyanov, exhausted and pale, was waiting for him, surrounded by papers. Besides him, there were two remaining members of Kholodov's tourist group in the cabin. A woman, a secretary, or rather, a personal assistant, about 30 years old, and a local guide. Voron knew that the most unpleasant thing awaited him. A plunge into the city mud, where the truth does not show through the traces, but hides behind verbose lies. The conflict with the police began immediately. Ivan Andreevich, do you understand what you've done? Demyanov could barely contain his trembling. Now it's officially murder. You've put our entire department at risk. Moscow is demanding a report. And what do we have? A splinter with chemicals. Voron, ignoring his emotional outburst, put his backpack in the corner. It wasn't the truth that put your department at risk, but the one who disregarded it. The bear is not to blame. Give me the names and the map. Demyanov, realizing that shouting at Voron would not work, handed him a thick folder. Here you go. The victim is Yegor Kholodov, owner of Azimut Stroy LLC. He supposedly came here to hunt, but found time to meet with local forestry and gold mining moguls. He wanted to settle here, bought up shares, offered investments, but, as I see it, he was just trying to take over the local market. He was as greedy as the devil himself, according to his assistant. Voron was not interested in business. He was interested in behavior. He looked at the two witnesses. The woman, Elena, sat huddled, her expensive but now dirty clothes clearly contrasting with the surroundings. Next to her sat the guide, a stocky, strong man of about 45, with a face long accustomed to wind and cold. It was him that Voron remembered. It was Fyodor Komarov, a former gamekeeper who had been expelled from the reserve for poaching 5 years ago, but who had a reputation as a skilled but dishonest hunter. Voron approached Fyodor. The guide was tense but outwardly calm. He looked at Voron warily, like an animal that senses danger but shows no fear. "Komarov," Voron said in a low, hoarse voice. "I remember you. You know this taiga. You were with Kholodov last." Fyodor nodded. "I found him. We walked a couple of kilometers away from the camp. He wanted to look at an old settlement, according to an old map. Then he said he wanted to be alone. I came back, and in the evening he was gone. In the morning I started looking for him and I found what I found." Voron ignored his words. He asked a question that only someone familiar with the laws of the taiga could understand. What did Kholodov smell like in his last hours? Not cologne. What did he eat? What did he drink? Was there anything foreign about him? The question was strange, and Fyodor was momentarily confused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Foreign? Well, he drank whiskey. A lot. And he smoked cigars. Expensive ones. Nothing foreign, Ivan Andreevich. What kind of question is that? The beast has come. Voron turned to Elena. You were with him for a long time. How did he behave before his death? Was he nervous? Angry? At whom? The woman, sensing the attention of this man who resembled a living piece of taiga, spoke more quietly and frankly than she had with Demyanov. He was furious. Not because of the forest, because of money. He was going to make a deal here, a very big one, with the local gold miners. And yesterday he got a call. He talked for half an hour, and then he started shouting. He said they were trying to cheat him, that the land they promised him already belonged to someone else. He mentioned the name, Makarov. He said that Makarov, the owner of some small gold mine, had crossed the line and would regret it. Voron immediately looked at Fyodor. The gamekeeper sat with a stony face. Makarov? Do you know anyone by that name, Fyodor? Fyodor shook his head. There are lots of people here who dabble in gold. I don't remember. Voron knew he was lying. In this area, everyone knew everyone else, especially those who worked the land. The guide was lying, but he was lying carefully. Demyanov interjected. Makarov, Ivan Andreevich, is Nikolai Makarov. He has an old, illegal mine in the mountains, but he hasn't worked there for a long time. We checked him out. He's clean. He's clean because you're looking at the address, not the smell, Voron said, his contempt for their methods poorly concealed. He took the map Demyanov had prepared from the table, an old yellowed topographical diagram of the area. He quickly found the mouth of the Black River, the site of the murder, and traced his finger around the area where the killer had gone, using the water. Fyodor, you said that Kholodov wanted to look at a hut on the old map. Voron looked up at the guide. What hut? And why did Kholodov, a Muscovite, have an old map of the taiga? Fyodor hesitated again, but quickly found an answer. He didn't have a map. He said he bought the coordinates from an old man in the village, and the hunting lodge, it's abandoned. Hunters used to live there. It's not far from here, off the trail. by the stream. There were too many coincidences. The hut, the former gamekeeper, the stream, knowledge of the area. Voron realized that this hut was the key link. It was either the place where the killer had gone, or his laboratory. He unfolded the map and pointed to the place marked Komarov's cabin. Not the one Fyodor had mentioned, but another, more remote place. Whose is this? Voron pointed to the spot. Demyanov looked. It's an old poacher's trail. No one's been there for 30 years. Voron looked at Fyodor, who swallowed nervously. Fyodor Komarov, gamekeeper, poacher, and he knew this area. Voron returned to the table, his gaze falling on the bag containing the chip, with the scent of the attractant. Fyodor, Voron picked up the chip. Do you know what this is? It's someone else's trap. It's what makes a bear kill. You were a gamekeeper. You must know where to find such a thing. It's illegal.
Fyodor shrugged.
I have no idea. I'm just a guide. The bears are on their own.
Ivan Andreevich stopped looking at him. He looked at the map, at the old marks.
Kholodov, greedy and arrogant, had come to take the land, either from the small-time gold miner Makarov or from Fyodor, who may have had his own secret interests in the reserve. And Fyodor, as a former gamekeeper, knew how to use his knowledge of wildlife against its violators. And he had the profile. A limp, knowledge of the area, skills in stealthy movement. Voron realized that he had to check the hut that Fyodor had mentioned, and the one he hadn't mentioned, the Komarov's hut. The killer must have left his tools and motive there. He took the map, folded it, and turned toward the exit. Demyanov, take care of Makarov. I'm going to the hunting lodge Komarov mentioned. He said Kholodov wanted to be alone. Why? What did he need to hide? Maybe it wasn't a hunt, but a meeting. Voron left the cabin. Behind him lay the noisy, nervous world of city filth, where people lied to each other for money and power. He left them their papers and motives, and took for himself what the taiga had brought. A barely noticeable trail, the smell of gunpowder, and the knowledge that the man he was looking for was not running, but hiding. His path lay towards Zaimka, where, according to his calculations, if not the killer himself, then at least his weapon must be hidden. He knew he was entering the territory of another predator, and this knowledge was, in his eyes, the only thing of true value. He stepped into the forest, and the shadow followed him. The quiet, barely discernible reading of tracks was over. Now, based on the lies of the guide Fyodor Komarov and circumstantial evidence, Raven headed for the hut that Fyodor had tried to hide, calling it old and long abandoned. On the map he took from Demyanov, this place was marked vaguely as Komarov's cabin, not official land, but a private, inhabited place. It was the perfect hideout for a man who had to disappear, leaving behind only the fury of a bear. The road took Voron in shadow almost the whole day. He walked along old, barely discernible paths that he knew from his time working in the reserve. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in thick, bloody tones, when they came out onto a small clearing, overgrown with spruce trees. In the center of it stood a hut, not a dilapidated, crumbling shack, but a sturdy, well-built structure, albeit old. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, but the stovepipe was clean, a sign of recent use. Voron stopped, listening to the silence. Shadow, as if sensing the proximity of the master they were looking for, tensed up, the hair on her neck standing on end. But the dog did not growl. She only let out a low, questioning whine.
Here, Shadow. His scent is here, Raven said quietly, and his gaze began to scan the perimeter, searching for the uninvited guest. He slowly walked around the hut. Everything looked abandoned. Old firewood covered with lichen, a rusty axe stuck in a log. But Raven saw something else. He saw that the door, locked with a rusty padlock, had actually been closed recently. There were barely noticeable scratches around the lock, left by a screwdriver or a key, and the ground in front of the threshold had been carefully swept with fir branches to hide the tracks. The killer hadn't just left. He had preserved his hideout so he could return. Voron knew he wouldn't find Fyodor Komarov himself here, but he had to find his essence, his tools, his weapons, his lies. He didn't need city lockpicks. He took a small crowbar out of his backpack, which he always carried with him. 2 sharp, precise blows, and the lock broke with a loud metallic screech. The sound echoed through the taiga, but Raven wasn't worried. No one would hear him here. Inside, it was dim, thick, and dusty. The hut was furnished ascetically, but functionally. A bed, a table, a couple of shelves, a stove. Voron immediately smelled a strong, sharp odor that was not the smell of dampness or taiga herbs. It was the smell of gun oil, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and metal. Weapons were stored here, and they had been cleaned very recently. This was the home of a specialist. Voron did not rush. He began his analysis by comparing what he saw with the profile of Fyodor that he had drawn in his mind. Old maps, darkened by time, hung on the wall. These were not tourist maps, but detailed topographical plans with notes made in red pencil. River mouths, old gold mines, abandoned trails. Some areas were circled in bold. These were obviously places of particular interest.
On one of the maps, in an area of the mountain range that was inaccessible to ordinary passage, Voron saw a note. Nick. Gold mine. It was Nikolai Makarov, the small-time gold miner that Kholodov's assistant had mentioned. So Fyodor Komarov had lied when he said he didn't know Makarov. What's more, he knew where his mine was and how to get there. Voron examined the table. On it, under a thin layer of dust, he found several tiny, barely noticeable scratches, traces of a heavy, square object that had recently stood there. It was the very object whose imprint he had found at the resting place. Perhaps a box of equipment or a safe. This confirmed that Fyodor Komarov was carrying this very load with him when he returned after the murder. Ivan Andreevich turned his attention to the shelves. There, among the jars of dried herbs and supplies, he noticed one strange thing. A small, tightly closed wooden box. It did not look decorative. On the contrary, it was roughly made, but sturdy. Voron picked it up. The box was unexpectedly light, but when shaken, something rattled softly inside. He pried the lid open with his knife, and it gave way. Inside, on a velvet lining, lay a pair of old, but well-polished, brown bear claws. It was not just a souvenir. It was a trophy, a sign of power, and, more importantly, next to the claws lay a small glass test tube with the remains of a clear, oily liquid. Raven carefully removed the test tube and held it up to the light. Immediately, he smelled a sharp, concentrated chemical odor. It was the same alien bite he had detected at the crime scene, but here it was pure and undiluted.
It was a synthetic attractant, a highly concentrated pheromone banned from free circulation. It was used to study and capture animals in laboratory conditions. But in the hands of a poacher, it became the perfect weapon. It was proof.
Voron felt his facial muscles tense.
He was standing in the lair of a killer who, like his double, knew the taiga, could read tracks, respected strength, but had betrayed all these laws from money and revenge. Fyodor Komarov was an expert. He used his deep knowledge of bear behavior to create the perfect alibi. He didn't just kill Kholodov. He made the taiga itself, its very fury, cover up his crime. Ivan Andreevich closed the box. He didn't take it with him. He just took the test tube with the attractant. That was enough to break Fyodor. Now he knew that Kholodov, a greedy Moscow predator, had encountered another predator, more experienced and knowledgeable. And this local predator decided that his justice was above the law. Voron examined the hut once more. He noticed a small, neat hiding place under the floor, covered with a piece of board. Inside, he found only an old, thick notebook, similar to a diary. He did not open it, putting it aside for later. His priority was the trajectory. He knew that Fyodor Komarov, confident in his perfect disguise, couldn't have gone far. He had to be somewhere where he felt safe, and where he could use his heavy, square load. The only logical place Fyodor could have gone was his accomplice's hideout, or the place of his true interest, Nikolai Makarov's mine in the mountains. Fyodor was cornered, and like any cornered animal, he had to return to his nest, or to someone he trusted. The raven looked at the map, at the steep path leading into the mountains, which Fyodor had carefully circled in red pencil. This trail led to a pass, and further on to abandoned gold mines. He realized that the killer was not running from the police, but was lying low to start a new life, using either Makarov's gold or the documents he had possibly stolen from Kholodov. Voron left the hut, locking the door with a broken lock, leaving it in the same condition he had found it. He left no traces, except those that were visible only to him. He knew that when the police got here, they would find only confirmation that Fyodor Komarov was a poacher and possibly a murderer. But Voron had found something more. His method. He felt that from now on, he was not just following a trail, but the soul of a criminal. His path lay in the mountains to Makarov. Now the hunt had become personal. Ivan Andreevich knew that a man who used such sophisticated methods as baiting a bear would not run along open roads like a hunted dog. Fyodor Komarov was a predator, and his psychology dictated that he lie low. A killer, confident that his perfect alibi had worked, would choose not the fastest, but the safest and most difficult route. He would go where no one but him would dare or be able to look for him. Voron studied the topographic map he had taken from Demyanov. In this region, the mountain range created a natural barrier, and Makarov's old, abandoned mines were located high up in a crevice, accessible only by a long-forgotten trail marked by Komarov on his personal map with a red pencil. This route was not just difficult, it was forbidden to outsiders, requiring a deep knowledge of mountain crossing and survival techniques. Voron's tactic was simple. He did not try to find fresh tracks which Fyodor had carefully covered up by the stream. He tried to find his trajectory, his logic. If Fyodor was carrying something heavy, a square box with supplies, or perhaps documents and gold stolen from Kholodov, he couldn't walk along the water for long. He had to go ashore and either use a boat to go up the Black River tributary or return to the walking route. Voron, following his intuition, decided that a boat was too big a risk. The killer chose a hidden path, on foot. He headed upstream, keeping 100 meters away from the water, so that his footsteps would not be drowned out by the sound of the stream. The shadow walked ahead, its nose working not on the trail, but on the landscape. Voron was looking for a place where the killer could get out of the water, using a natural barrier, a fallen tree, a large rock, or a rocky outcrop. And such a place was found after 2 hours of difficult walking. Where the stream made a sharp bend, its banks narrowed, forming a small rocky cape, protected from view by thick, low-growing cedar trees. Raven discovered this place by the strange arrangement of stones. Several large rounded boulders had been moved, and beneath them were traces of fresh moss that had been torn away and lay on lighter, dry ground. It was a subtle but obvious effort to create a convenient exit from the water, hidden from view. Raven crouched down, examining the ground. There were no clear boot prints here, but there was another clue. Thin, parallel scratches on the stone, as if from metal being dragged across a rough surface. It was the same heavy square load that he had mentally attributed to Fyodor. The load was not light, and Fyodor, given his limp, had to drag it to conserve energy. From that point on, the trail became clearer, though no less difficult to follow. Fyodor did not return to the path he had used to approach Kholodov. He chose a secret path that led straight up into the mountains, to the pass, bypassing any settlements and known campsites. It was a trail that Voron knew from old maps as Bear Loop, a route used exclusively by poachers and illegal gold miners in ancient times. Voron walked, reading the trail. Fyodor did not try to hide every step, as he would when approaching his prey. He knew that no one was looking for him here. He moved confidently, but with a constant eye on defense. At each stop, which Voron could identify by the accumulation of cigarette butts or scraps of synthetic tape, Fyodor chose a position that gave him maximum visibility and rear protection. He looked not at the forest, but through it. This confirmed the worst suspicions. Fyodor was lying low, but his goal was not to run away, but to fortify himself in the safest place possible. The mountains, where he could use his weapons and his knowledge of the terrain. His final destination was obviously Makarov's mine. Why the mine? Voron began to analyze the motive, combining it with psychology. Kholodov, a Moscow developer, wanted to take land away from Makarov and possibly from Fyodor. As a local, Fyodor would not have engaged in an open struggle with Kholodov's money and connections. He chose the taiga method, the perfect, indisputable murder. Now that Kholodov was dead, Fyodor probably decided to take his place, or take back what he considered his, taking advantage of the situation. The heavy load he was carrying could have been not only weapons, but also evidence, or even gold that he had collected at the mine. The killer's trail led up a narrow, almost vertical climb, where Voron had to use all his rock climbing skills. On this climb, Fyodor left a lot of traces of his load, deep grooves in the rock where he probably hooked the box with a rope. Voron imagined the scene. A cold-blooded killer, limping, dragging a heavy box uphill to his new hideout. He was not cornered. He was confident in his righteousness and his impunity. When they reached the top, the taiga spread out below them like a carpet. From here, Raven could clearly see the valley and the vague outlines of the mountain passes in the distance. The shadow suddenly stopped. Its ears pricked up. It caught a scent that Raven could not yet smell. Smoke. And this smoke was not from a forest fire, but from a stove. Voron took out his binoculars. In the distance, in a narrow, wind-protected crevice, he could see dilapidated buildings that almost blended in with the rocks. Forgotten gold mines. They were so well hidden that the police, searching the perimeter, would never have found them. But Fyodor knew this area. He had been here. And judging by the smoke, he wasn't just hiding. He was living there. The discovery was complete.
Fyodor Komarov had chosen the perfect hideout, the old Makarov mines, which he could only reach via the Bear's Loop. He was hiding when no one would look for him, and had probably already begun illegal mining or was waiting for someone to sell his stolen goods to. Voron realized that he had not simply caught up with the killer. He had found his new lair.
Now Voron had to act with the utmost caution. Unlike a bear, a man in his nest is armed and ready to defend himself. He knew that he was entering the territory of another predator, no less dangerous than himself. The hunt for the man had begun. The climb was difficult. The sun had long since disappeared behind the steep, lichen-covered slopes, and a cold, permeated by the sharp smell of pine needles and damp stone, reigned in the mountains. Raven and Shadow moved along the Bear Loop, a trail that required not just strength, but almost animal endurance. Every step was a test of strength. Every rock could break loose. Raven walked, completely focused on his movement, but his mind, like an old mill, was grinding through information about the criminal. He spoke with Shadow, discussing not hunting, but psychology. "He thinks he's being clever, Shadow," Raven whispered hoarsely, clinging to a protruding root. "He thinks he's made us watch the bear while he escapes to safety. He's used the law of the forest against the law of men." Laika, sensing her master's tension, only whimpered softly, pressing herself against his leg. For both of them, it was not just tracking, but a philosophical confrontation. The killer, Fyodor Komarov, was sure his cover was perfect. The bear had destroyed not only the body, but also all traces of human violence. No shell casings, no fingerprints, no direct evidence linking Fyodor to Kholodov. But it was precisely in this self-confidence, in this contempt for nature, that his mistake lay. He forgot that the forest does not forgive, Shadow. Continued Raven. "You cannot take the fury of a bear and then simply return and start all over again. A beast is not a mask. It is a living sentence." The bear, set up by Fyodor, was forced to become part of human meanness, violating his own wild code, and the one who used him had to answer for it. The Raven understood that Fyodor thought like a hunted beast, who, once trapped, did not run aimlessly, but sought a nest. Makarov's gold mines were the perfect lair. They give him time. No one searches where everyone has forgotten. Resources, the possibility of illegal mining, and safety, a place that is easy to defend. The ascent continued. Voron, using his binoculars, regularly scanned the route ahead, looking for any signs of traps or ambushes. He knew that Fyodor, as a former gamekeeper, was familiar with survival and defense tactics.
If he was waiting for someone who might come after him, perhaps Makarov himself, or Kholodov's accomplices, he was already prepared. He began to prepare for a confrontation.
Voron was not walking like a police officer intent on making an arrest, but like a hunter intent on cornering his prey. In this wilderness, his inner code demanded not the criminal code, but the restoration of balance.
He knew that if he went straight ahead, Fyodor, armed and cautious, would be able to spot him from the height of the mountain crevice, which offered a perfect view. Ivan Andreevich slowed his pace. He found the perfect route to the mines. He did not use the open, albeit hidden, path. Instead, he chose a slope that was almost impassable, densely overgrown with stone birch and sharp, slippery shale fragments. For him, a man with many years of experience, this path was the only way to approach the lair unnoticed. He took his old hunting knife out of his backpack, his constant companion in the taiga. He checked it, as one checks a weapon before battle. Raven's philosophy was simple. He was not seeking revenge, he was seeking order. A man who uses nature for crime must be removed from the ecosystem. When they reached the top, Raven sensed a change in the air. It became thinner, drier, colder. And there was a distinct smell of smoke and metal ore. They were very close. Raven stopped, pressing himself against a boulder. He gave Shadow the command. Wait. The dog lay down, blending in with the rocks and moss, her tense gaze fixed on the same spot as her master. Ivan Andreevich took out his binoculars. In a crevice under a rock, he could clearly see 3 dilapidated wooden structures, almost black with age. One of them, a small hut, was clearly inhabited. There was a fresh layer of moss on the roof, and a thin, barely noticeable stream of smoke curled from the chimney. Next to the hut stood a shovel and a wheelbarrow, which had clearly been used to transport heavy stones. Fyodor Komarov wasn't just hiding. He was working. Voron lowered his binoculars, a cold, heavy light flashing in his eyes. He realized that Fyodor Komarov was not going to leave. He had found himself a new kingdom, which he intended to defend to the last. And now he would have to face a man who knew his methods and would not forgive him for betraying the laws of the taiga. He began his slow, cautious infiltration, using every rock and every shadow as cover. He was ready for battle because he knew that here, in the mountains, the only law was strength and justice. Voron and Shadow approached the old mines with maximum stealth. The mountain crevice, where the dilapidated buildings were located, served as an ideal natural fortress. It could only be approached from one side, along a steep, rocky slope. Any movement, any sound, echoed, giving Fyodor Komarov, if he was inside, a significant advantage. Raven knew that his opponent was no amateur. Fyodor was a master of the taiga, and now, driven into his last refuge, he would act like a defending predator, as cautiously and as aggressively as possible. Voron stopped 50 meters from the buildings, covered by thick cedar undergrowth. He took out his binoculars. His gaze, heavy and calm, began to methodically scan the perimeter. The buildings were squat, blending in with the grey stone. In the central hut, where he had previously seen smoke, there was a narrow, dark slit serving as a window. Raven looked for signs of an ambush, and he found them. At the entrance to the hut lay not just stones, but neatly stacked masonry, barely visible under a layer of moss. It was an embrasure shield that allowed the shooter to fire while remaining relatively safe. Fyodor wasn't expecting the police with their slow, predictable methods. He was expecting Raven, or someone equally skilled, who could find him by invisible tracks. Moreover, Raven noticed thin synthetic threads, stretched almost to ground level on the cedar branches thrown across the crevice. It was a signaling system,
primitive but reliable. Designed to warn Fyodor of any intrusion, Raven realized that Fyodor was not alone, or else he was very cautious. A lone man, especially after a murder, usually becomes nervous and chaotic. Fyodor, on the other hand, demonstrated calculated, cold-blooded planning.
"He's sure I'm following him," Raven whispered. This confidence meant that Komarov was ready for confrontation and had probably chosen this place not only for gold mining, but also for his final battle. He carefully checked all the buildings. In addition to the main hut where the hearth was burning, Voron saw a small shed, apparently used to store tools and wheelbarrows, as well as the entrance to a blocked tunnel. An old mine. At the entrance to the tunnels lay a mountain of freshly mined wet ore, confirming his guess. Fyodor was actively working to extract gold. He didn't just want to hide. He wanted to get his hands on the riches that had brought Kholodov to the taiga.
Voron shifted his attention to the only loophole, a narrow passage on the western slope of the ravine that allowed him to bypass the buildings and enter from the rear.
This route was the most dangerous, as it led through open space, from where Fyodor, sitting in his nest, could conduct perfect sniper fire. At that moment, the tension reached its peak.
The Raven, which had already begun to move toward the alternate route, suddenly heard a faint sound. It was not the snap of a branch, but something more artificial, a metallic grinding that lasted a fraction of a second and then disappeared.
This sound could only have been made by a rifle bolt being cocked or checked.
Raven instantly pressed himself to the ground, blending in with the moss and stones. The shadow, which always reacted to his inner state, froze, becoming completely motionless. Raven raised his binoculars. The window of the hut remained dark, but now Raven saw a reflection which he had not noticed before, a faint glare on the glass that could only have come from an optical sight. "Confrontation," Raven said quietly, as if exhaling. Fyodor knew he was here, and now he was waiting. He took up a sniper position, ready to kill whoever had disturbed his peace. This was not an escape, but a defense of his territory to the last. He was armed, dangerous, and, most importantly, he was on his own land. Voron realized that a direct confrontation was impossible here. Fyodor had a perfect view and powerful weapons. Voron did not carry firearms. He trusted only his knife and his instincts. He had to use what was available to him, nature and psychology. He had to make Fyodor believe that he had outmaneuvered him, or that he was not where they expected him to be. He slowly, almost millimeter by millimeter, moved away from the rock behind which he was hiding, and took a small, dry piece of cedar bark out of his pocket. He slowly threw it in the opposite direction from where he had come, causing it to roll down the slope with a crash. It was a warning, intended to give Fyodor false information about his location. Like a chess player, Raven made his first move, forcing his opponent to reveal himself. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, from the darkness of the window, Raven saw a flash. A dull, dry shot echoed through the mountains. The bullet hit the rock where Raven had been a second ago, leaving a jagged, white scar on it. The shot was accurate, made by a master. Fyodor Komarov did not hesitate. He shot to kill. Crouching low to the ground, Raven felt a cold, sharp thrill. The game had begun. This was not just a hunt for a killer. It was a duel between two masters of the taiga, where the weapons were not only iron, but also knowledge of every rock, every sound, every instinct. Fyodor knew that Voron was alive, and now he would wait. Voron, using the element of surprise, had to get out of the line of fire and corner him. He gave Shadow a barely perceptible signal.
Despite the shot, the dog remained completely calm, ready for the next command. He knew that Shadow, with her keen senses, would be his only and most reliable ally. He had to use nature against the man who had betrayed it. Now that Fyodor had taken up his sniper position, Raven could begin his flanking maneuver. He had to force the predator out of its nest. Raven knew that after the shot, he had no more than 5 minutes before Fyodor Komarov, confident in his firing position, would counterattack or change position. It was a direct but silent confrontation between two masters of survival, where delay meant death. Raven, who had no firearms, had to use his main advantage, his deep knowledge of the landscape and his predator's instinct. He slowly, almost crawling, moved out of the firing zone, using the slightest unevenness in the ground as cover. His plan was simple: to drive Fyodor out of his ideal nest. The rifle was a strength, but also a weakness. It required time to aim and reload, as well as open space. The Raven, on the other hand, was a master of close combat and vertical movement. He chose the most dangerous route, a steep, almost vertical slope covered with stone slabs that led around the crevice, directly above the mine buildings. Any ordinary person would have considered this path impossible. But for Raven, it was the only option. He moved, clinging to sharp slate ledges and strong, low branches. His hands and feet, sinewy and strong, worked like hooks, and his gaze constantly monitored the hut's window. As he crawled upward, Raven gave Shadow a non-verbal command. The dog, sensing the seriousness of the situation, remained below. But now she had to create a diversion. Raven threw a clump of moss, impregnated with a faint scent of attractant that he had brought from Fyodor's hut, toward the open space in front of the hut. Shadow reacted instantly. She rose, let out a low, aggressive growl that immediately echoed off the rocks, and made a short, quick run around the perimeter, as if to demonstrate her presence, and then instantly disappeared into the thickets, away from the line of fire. It was not an attack, but a diversion, calculated to play on Fyodor's psychology. The killer, focused on the sniper position, would have to conclude that Voron, or someone looking for him, was now below and using the dog to attack. Fyodor fell for it. Voron saw through his binoculars how the silhouette in the window flinched and moved, and then a second shot followed, aimed lower, in the direction from which Tenny's bark came. The shot was nervous and hasty. That moment was enough for Voron. Fyodor was distracted from his advantage of height and open view. Voron continued his vertical approach. He knew he had to get above Fyodor to prevent him from using his rifle and force him out of his fortification. He crawled through the dead zone, where Fyodor couldn't see him without leaning out of the window. When he reached the ridge, directly above the crevice, Raven froze. He looked down at the roof of the hut. There was complete silence, broken only by his heavy, labored breathing. He climbed down the steep slope, using the thin cracks in the rock. Now he was behind Fyodor's lair, completely hidden from the hut's window. He approached the back wall of the hut. It was made of old, thick logs, but in one place near the ground, Raven noticed a small, camouflaged hatch covered with a piece of tin, an emergency exit. As an experienced taiga dweller, Fyodor always had to have a way to retreat. Voron pressed his ear against the logs, listening to the sounds inside. He heard heavy breathing. Fyodor was inside, tense and waiting. He was obviously sure that Voron was trying to get around him from the front. Voron took a small cat out of his backpack, a metal hook on a thin but strong cable. He knew he had to provoke Fyodor,
but do it in such a way as to deprive him of the opportunity to use his weapon. He tied the cat to the edge of the barn next to the hut and pulled. The cat came loose with a screech, hitting the wall of the barn.
The sound was loud, imitating an attempted break-in. Then Raven, using the cable, began to swing the barn door, creating a loud rumbling that was supposed to attract Fyodor's attention. It worked. The Raven heard objects clattering inside the hut, followed by Fyodor's loud, hoarse cry.
"Who's there? Go away!"
"I'll shoot." Thinking that someone was sneaking up on him and trying to steal his gold, Fyodor decided that the attack was coming from the barn. This was his psychological weakness, greed, which outweighed caution. Fyodor had to leave his fortification to get a better view. Voron heard the back door of the hut, the very same hatch, open quietly. Fyodor, armed with a rifle, crouched down and cautiously made his way to the barn. He was limping, and his movements were slow and tense. It was the moment Raven had been waiting for. Like a ghost, he leaped out of the shadows and, using his powerful, trained strength, delivered a precise blow to Fyodor's leg, the one that was injured. Fyodor fell, the rifle slipping from his hands. Raven, not giving him time to recover, leaned on him and pinned his arms. "Checkmate, Fyodor," he said quietly but decisively. The direct confrontation was over. Voron did not kill. He hunted. He used nature to deceive a man who thought he had surpassed that nature. Fyodor lay on the ground, choking with pain and rage. His eyes, the eyes of a trapped beast, staring at Voron with wild, impotent anger. Voron felt no satisfaction. He had merely restored order. Now he needed to find out why. After Fyodor Komarov was immobilized and tied up, the Raven did not call the police right away. He needed a conversation, an informal interrogation, in the language of the taiga, where lies have no meaning and the truth is simply survival. The Raven dragged Fyodor into the hut and sat him down against the wall. Shadow, receiving the command to guard, lay down by the door, becoming an invisible border. The hut was warm from a long burnt-out but still warm hearth, and smelled of ore, smoke, and old moss. Fyodor, a former gamekeeper, broken physically but not in spirit, looked at Raven with eyes full of impotent rage. His face was covered with a layer of dust, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He did not ask for mercy. He just breathed heavily. "Well, Voron?" His voice was hoarse and cracked. "Are you a hero now? You found the poacher who killed the capital scum. Pat yourself on the head. You don't even know what you really found." Raven didn't answer, letting him finish. He took the test tube with the attractant he had found in his hut out of his pocket and placed it on the table. Then he laid out a piece of foil with the remains of the bait he had found on the bear trail, and a notebook with maps of the mines. "I know, Fyodor," Voron finally said slowly. "I found your stash. You used what was supposed to protect nature to hide human wickedness. Tell me, why?" Fyodor laughed, and the laugh was dry, like the rustling of old leaves. "Why? Protection, Kholodov. That creature came here to take the land. Not mine. Nikolai Makarov's land. My comrades. Did you see that hut? The two of us found a vein here, up here, a few years ago. Illegally, yes. But it's ours.
It belongs to the taiga.
And this Kholodov, the owner of Azimut Stroy LLC, forged documents, bribed officials, and decided that we were in his way. Seeing that Voron was listening rather than judging, Fyodor continued, his voice growing stronger.
He came to force us to sell the mine for pennies. He threatened us with the police, prison, bears. How ironic, right? We met by the stream. I took him where he wanted to go, to the place he considered his. I told him, "Go away. The taiga won't accept you." And he replied, "I'll buy all your taiga, Fyodor, and I'll buy you too." And then came the confession. He didn't want to leave, Fyodor said, looking at the test tube with hatred. I didn't kill him in the literal sense. I used poison. Fast-acting, from old stocks. Paralyzing. He just lost consciousness. I laid him on the ground and applied the bait, that synthetic musk. I knew that my bear, who was trained to recognize that scent, would come. He would come for his reward. Fyodor, as if proud of his monstrous logic, explained his trick in detail. The bear, he did all the dirty work, the wounds, the torn flesh, the perfect cover.
No one will look for a bullet, poison, or a blow with a blunt object when there is a bear. All traces of human violence have been destroyed. And most importantly, everyone will believe it was an accident. I created the perfect crime, Raven. I made the law of the forest work for me. And now the land will remain ours. Raven listened silently, his gaze fixed on Fyodor's face. He saw not remorse, but pride in his ingenuity. Fyodor felt no guilt for killing Kholodov, whom he considered a sick individual, who had upset the balance. His guilt lay elsewhere, in betraying the laws that he himself knew and respected. Are you proud that you used the beast as a garbage collector? Asked Raven. His voice was low, like distant thunder. The bear did not attack for food. He was full. His rage was unnatural. You didn't just lure him. You angered him. Fyodor grinned as if this was his final trump card. Why do you think he tried so hard? I didn't just use an attractant, Raven. I used chemical stress. This musk doesn't just stimulate the animal's appetite. It makes it aggressive. It's like a drug. The bear wasn't just lured. It was driven into a rage to destroy not only the body, but everything around it. It was revenge for the land he wanted to take away. Voron closed his eyes. He realized that he was dealing not just with a murderer, but with a man who had taken his specialization to an absolute, diabolical perversion. He didn't just hide the murder. He turned it into an act of wild nature, using its own instincts against the victim. It was a violation of the natural order of things, the most terrible crime in the Raven's eyes. He pulled his old hunting knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the dim light of the heart. Fyodor flinched, but did not look away. You won't kill me, Raven, he croaked. You're not one of those. You'll bring your chain dogs. You have no right to judge me. Raven raised the knife but did not threaten. He began to slowly cut the rope that bound Fyodor. You're right, said Raven. I have no right to judge you by human law, but by the law of the taiga. You are already condemned. You used a beast to hide your cowardice. You are a sick individual, Fyodor. And a sick individual must be removed from the ecosystem.
Not by me, but by those who live by the laws that you have betrayed.
The raven stood up. He knew he had to restore balance. It was an emotional peak. The raven stood over the defeated Fyodor, an old hunting knife in his hand, but its blade was lowered.
He was not going to punish the killer with his own hands, but he was not going to hand him over immediately to the city police, who saw Fyodor only as a criminal, not as a man who had betrayed something greater. You fought for your land, Fyodor, Raven said quietly, with a hint of fatigue, looking into the gamekeeper's eyes. Your revenge on Kholodov is understandable. A greedy man came to take what he thought was his. That is the law of the weak. But your method is the law of decay. Fyodor, breathing heavily, turned away in anger. I defended what belonged to me. If I had followed your law, I would have rotted in court while that Moscow rat rewrote all our mountains to himself.
I chose the justice of the taiga. You chose cowardice. Voron's voice became as hard as ice, using poison to immobilize and using a beast to hide your hand. You, a man of the taiga, made the bear your mask. You defiled his instinct. You broke the law of the forest. For Raven, this was not just a metaphor, it was philosophy, the cornerstone of his life. He himself had been expelled from the reserve for going against the powerful, but he had never crossed the line. He had never used wild nature as a tool for human baseness. A beast must remain a beast. A man must remain a man.
Mixing these roles, especially for such a perverse purpose, was the worst crime in his eyes. The bear is not your mask, Fyodor. The bear is part of the order. You made him commit an unnatural rage, for which he may pay with his life if he is caught.
You thought about yourself,
Your gold, your revenge. But you did not think about balance.
Raven bent down, picked up Fyodor's rifle, and carefully unloaded it, throwing the cartridges aside. Then he took a test tube of attractant out of the hut and smashed it against a rock. The sharp, chemical smell instantly mixed with the clean mountain air, but immediately began to dissipate. Your weapon is destroyed.
All you have left behind is your trail and your lies. Fyodor, seeing the destruction of his perfect alibi, groaned. But it was not a groan of pain, but a groan of lost power. This changes nothing. Did you bring me here to lecture me?
I know you're just like them, Raven. You despise them, these city folk. Why don't you just leave me here? Justice is on my side. Justice is the restoration of order. Raven cut him off. He took a spare, strong rope out of his backpack and began to methodically tie Fyodor up. He tied him not roughly, but tightly, using nautical knots that gave him no chance of escape. You are a sick individual, Fyodor. You are a virus in the taiga, and you must be removed by those responsible for the laws you decided to circumvent. You will face the law of the people, and that will be your real punishment. Not prison, but the realization that your cunning was powerless against a simple eye and honest instinct. Voron felt the full weight of this emotional confrontation pressing down on him. He understood the motive, but he did not forgive the method. It was a deep inner sadness about how knowledge can be perverted. Fyodor Komarov knew the taiga as well as he did, but he used that knowledge not for life, but for death and deception. Having finished tying Fyodor, Voron took out his old radio, which he always carried in a sealed case. It took a few seconds to tune the frequency. Demyanov, Voron said in a hoarse, low voice that seemed to carry with it all the cold of the mountains.
I found him. Fyodor Komarov. Makarov Mine. Mountain Crevice, Bear Loop.
I'll send the coordinates. He gave the exact coordinates, which Demyanov would hardly be able to find without a helicopter. But now that was his problem. He has a rifle with him, Voron added, but immediately corrected himself.
The rifle is unloaded. There are traces of illegal gold mining, and I have material evidence of murder, the attractant. Get going, and bring Nikolai Makarov with you.
He needs to be here.
Voron did not wait for Demyanov's response, who was undoubtedly now gasping with excitement and bureaucratic horror. He turned off the radio. This was his action. He didn't kill, but he didn't show sympathy either. He handed Fyodor over to the system he despised, but which was the only way to remove the sick individual from the forest forever. Now all that remained was to wait. The Raven sat down at the entrance to the hut, took out his binoculars, and began to scan the horizon. His duty was done. He had found the truth hidden in the bear's embrace. He had restored balance, but a residue remained in his soul. The knowledge of how easily a person can betray their world if they are consumed by greed or revenge. He waited. The sun had already begun to sink toward the west, and the shadows in the mountains were becoming long, cold, and blue. Almost 10 hours passed before the silence of the mountain gorge was broken by the growing roar of propellers. Raven did not sleep, watching the bound Fyodor. The latter, resigned to the inevitable, remained silent, only occasionally cursing hoarsely through clenched teeth. The arrival of the helicopter carrying Lieutenant Demyanov and his capture team was the apotheosis of the city bustle that Raven so despised. The roar, the dust, the crash of the landing. It was all a crude alien intrusion into the tranquility of the mountains. When the blades fell silent, 2 policemen in camouflage, and Demyanov himself, looking both triumphant and completely exhausted, descended to the ground. The lieutenant approached Voron, his face glowing with a mixture of relief and disbelief.
Ivan Andreevich, you did it. We thought...
He stopped short when he saw Fyodor tied up. Komarov. So it was him. Are you hurt? The Raven just shook his head. He wasn't looking for praise or thanks. He pointed to Fyodor, to the rifle lying nearby, to the freshly dug ore, and to the broken test tube with the attractant. Here's your killer. Here's his motive. Illegal gold mining. Here is his weapon, a rifle and synthetic pheromone.
Demyanov and his men, acting hastily and nervously, began to examine the site. They found Kholodov's documents, which Fyodor had not had time to burn, hidden in the wall of the hut.
They found old but functional equipment for washing ore, and most importantly, they found Fyodor himself, who did not deny that Kholodov had come for his land and that he had dealt with him fairly. The police put Fyodor on a stretcher. He couldn't walk because of his injured leg. When they carried him past Voron, Fyodor raised his head. "You didn't win anyway, Voron," he croaked. "I defended what was mine, and the bear proved that my disguise was perfect. You are alone, but they are a whole system. They will forget him. But I defended the land." The Raven did not respond, but his gaze conveyed cold condemnation. He did not forgive the murder, but the method. Fyodor was defeated, but his pride in his cunning remained. When the commotion began to subside, Demyanov approached the Raven, handing him a folder with documents. "Thank you, Ivan Andreevich. You saved us. The case is closed. The killer has been found. The motive is clear. Moscow will be satisfied.
Here, we have prepared a document for you to sign. And this. He handed Voron an envelope with money. This is for your consultation. Very generous. Voron took the envelope, but immediately returned it to Demyanov.
I don't take money for restoring order. Take your papers back. I'm not a consultant, Demyanov. I'm a naturalist. And what I saw doesn't fit into your protocols. The beast is innocent. Remember that. He signed only one document, a brief conclusion confirming that Kholodov had been attacked by a bear after he had been immobilized, and that the animal had been lured by a synthetic pheromone. Voron did not go into details about unnatural rage and chemical stress. He knew that for the city folks, this would only be unnecessary complications. Ivan Andreevich. Demyanov rubbed the back of his neck, trying to find the right words. You could work with us. We would provide you with... Leave me alone, Demyanov, and leave the bear alone. He's not to blame.
He was just following his instincts, which this man has twisted.
Voron coldly said goodbye to the lieutenant, without waiting for Fyodor to be loaded into the helicopter. He didn't want to see the Taiga's last captive leave. When the helicopter, loaded with the captured equipment, flew away, leaving behind only the hum and smell of kerosene, silence reigned in the mountains once more. Raven was left alone. He had to fulfill his epilogue on the spot. He returned to the place where Fyodor had been tied up. He found the diary that Fyodor had kept and the part where he described how he had found Kholodov. There were notes about how the visitor from Moscow had mocked him and his wild life. But there were no notes about gold or documents. Only pain and pride. Without reading any further, Voron threw the notebook into the hut's fireplace. All traces of human presence had to be erased. Then he went to the place where he had broken the test tube with the attractant. He gathered the glass shards and buried them deep in the ground. Then, using dry moss and pine needles, he carefully wiped all the stones that could have been touched by the pheromone to erase the foreign scent. He knew that nature would absorb the chemicals on its own, but it was his duty to help it along. He didn't want the bear, which had unwittingly become a killer, to return here, attracted by the scent, and become an easy target for other hunters. Raven moved slowly, his hands and feet working like those of an experienced restorer. He was restoring order. He removed the stones from the embrasure shield and cleared away the trampled grass. He wanted this place to look as if no one had touched it for decades. Standing on the crest of the mountain, Raven looked out over the valley. Humans are the most unpredictable predators. They use money to deceive, knowledge to kill, and their pride to justify any atrocity. Fyodor, who fought for his land, ultimately betrayed it, using its laws for his own revenge. Kholodov, who wanted to take everything, paid for his greed. And only nature, used in this dirty game, remained a silent victim. Ivan Andreevich felt a light breeze carrying the scent of pine needles, moss, and clean mountain water. The traces were washed away. Balance was restored. Now all that remained was for him to return to his own world, where he was alone, and where the law of the taiga was the only law he obeyed. Ivan Andreevich and the Shadow began their long, peaceful journey home. They descended from the mountains along the same bear loop, but now this difficult and dangerous path seemed peaceful. There was no longer tension and the smell of gunpowder in the air, only the clean, cool aroma of taiga grasses. The Raven walked, completely immersed in silence, his body moving rhythmically, without unnecessary effort.
He did not look back at the crevice where the police bustle and the bound Fyodor Komarov remained. His work was done, and the trail had been washed away. For the Raven, the journey home was not just a return, but a process of restoring his inner balance. With each step, he felt the city dirt that had stuck to him recede. The lies of the witnesses, Demyanov's bureaucratic fear, and even Fyodor's rage, which was so alien to the taiga philosophy.
He left people their laws, their justice, and their punishment. For him, only order was important. The shadow walked beside him, her steps soft and silent.
Freed from the need to search for foreign chemical smells, the dog focused again on the smells of her world. Hair tracks, lynx tracks, damp moss, and freshly fallen pine needles.
The Raven, watching her calm, instinctive movements, drew comfort from this. The shadow, like the taiga itself, was honest. She did not know how to pretend, and did not pursue false goals.
They came to the stream that had swallowed the killer's tracks 3 days ago. The Raven stopped on the rocky bank. He saw how the water, clear and cold, continued its eternal movement, washing away the last, barely noticeable traces of human intrusion. The water did not judge or remember. It simply flowed, returning the landscape to its pristine state.
Ivan Andreevich took out his hunting knife, his old, faithful companion. It was clean, but Voron used a damp cloth to carefully wipe the blade once more, then coated it with a thin layer of odorless oil. He examined the binoculars that had helped him see the reflection of the sniper's sight in the window of the hut. He wasn't just cleaning his tools, he was cleansing his memories, restoring their functional, neutral value.
As they descended deeper into the dense taiga, Voron began to reflect on the essence of what had happened. Fyodor Komarov believed that he was fighting for justice, defending his land from the greedy Moscow invaders.
But in this struggle, he betrayed all his knowledge. He used the bear, a symbol of the wild, indestructible power of the taiga, as a destroyer of evidence. It was the highest degree of perversion and cynicism.
In the eyes of Voron, Kholodov, and Fyodor, Fyodor was just one of two predators with different methods, but the same greed for power and possession. The sick individual has been removed, thought Voron.
It doesn't matter which one was Kholodov and which one was Fyodor.
What matters is that the balance will not be disturbed.
The bear, who unwittingly became the executor of someone else's will, escaped retribution. The police would never look for him, having taken away the main criminal.
The taiga took back its beast, restoring neutrality. When they finally reached his hut, the sun was already high in the sky, breaking through the pine branches. The air here was thick, warm, and smelled of moss and resin, the smell of home.
Raven took off his backpack and placed it by the porch. Shadow sighed contentedly and curled up by the stove, becoming an invisible ball of grey wool again. Ivan Andreevich entered the hut. Everything was in its place here. Old books, homemade furniture, shelves with herbs. This was his world, carved out of stone and silence, far from human passions and laws. He lit the stove, and soon a light smell of smoke and hot wood spread through the hut, drowning out the last, barely noticeable smells of the foreign road. The Raven sat by the window, where once again, only the crackling of wood and the quiet, soothing sound of the wind in the treetops reached him. He took out his binoculars and, without looking anywhere in particular, pointed them at the horizon. His gaze, heavy, calm, and incredibly attentive, became what it had been before.
There was no joy of victory or bitterness of defeat in it.
There was only conscious truth
And quiet sadness, which always remained after a confrontation with human baseness. He did not seek happiness, but he found honesty. The law of men prevailed over the criminal, and the law of the taiga prevailed over the violator of order. There was not the slightest desire in his soul to repeat this experience. He wanted his world to remain neutral and honest. His gaze slowly slid along the horizon, over the blue mountain peaks, which now held the secret of a Moscow developer, a former gamekeeper, and a mighty brown bear. The secret was closed, but justice remained. Raven knew that he might be called again. But while the tiger was silent, he would remain silent with it, waiting. He was the Raven, and his world was waiting only for order to be restored.